What would you do if your careless laughter about a man at work became the reason your husband called a lawyer the next morning? I thought I was being clever when I bragged that even his boss had made a move on me. But when my husband gathered his evidence and walked into a law office, I realized the joke had cost me everything. My name is Ophelia, and I am 33 years old, working as a receptionist in a busy medical office where the phones never stop ringing. My husband Michael is 36 and works as a logistics manager, which means long hours with spreadsheets and phone calls that I always found boring. We live in a suburban home with our 2 children, Sophie, who is 8, and Daniel, who is 6, and for years, people said we looked like a balanced family. They described me as lively and charming, while Michael was steady and quiet, and I liked that description because it made me feel special. But I started craving more attention than Michael gave me, and I began joking at his expense during family gatherings. Everyone laughed, and I felt powerful, so I told myself it was harmless. When Michael looked uncomfortable, I told people he was just too sensitive, and they nodded, because silence always looks like weakness. My sister Clara encouraged me, saying, "A woman should never let her husband forget who truly held the power." My father Edward excused me as playful, though I noticed the way his face sometimes tightened when I went too far. Michael's mother Helen, however, never smiled at my jokes and always looked at me like she saw through every excuse I made. I ignored her warnings because I wanted to believe I was right and everyone else was overreacting. One evening, during a family meal, I laughed and said even Michael's boss, Julian, had made a move on me, and the room went cold. I thought it was clever, but the silence that followed was heavier than anything I had ever felt before. The silence after my remark hung over the table like a heavy cloud, and I tried to laugh again, hoping someone would follow, but the laughter never came. Clara forced a chuckle to break the tension, but even she looked uneasy as her eyes flicked toward Michael. My father Edward shifted in his chair and said I was only being playful, but his tone carried doubt that made me feel briefly exposed. Helen's eyes bored into me with such sharpness that I felt stripped of every excuse I wanted to use. Michael did not say a word. He just sat there, with a calm face that unsettled me more than any anger would have. I told everyone he was sulking again and that he needed to learn to laugh at himself, and some nodded politely, though the air never returned to normal. Later that night, I convinced myself I had won again, because Michael's silence had always meant he was retreating, and in my mind, retreating meant weakness. I believed I had proven that I was still the exciting one, while he was predictable and dull. What I did not notice was the way he stared at me with a calm that looked more like calculation than defeat. At work the next week, Julian leaned close during a conversation and told me I looked beautiful that morning. I felt flattered and important in a way Michael never managed to make me feel anymore. I began letting Julian's compliments feed a hunger I had been ignoring, and I convinced myself that there was no harm because it was just attention. Clara encouraged me by saying I deserved to feel alive, and that Michael should be grateful I had stayed faithful when I clearly had better choices. Her words made me feel justified, and I started meeting Julian for coffees after my shifts. He told me I was interesting and fun, and I carried those words home like trophies to hold against Michael's quiet ways. During a dinner with friends, I started bragging about how even Julian seemed to admire me more than Michael ever did. The laughter around the table was nervous and unsure, but I pretended not to notice. Michael sat there with the same calm face, saying nothing, while I smiled as if I had scored a victory. Later, I told him he was ruining the mood with his silence, and I claimed he was always too serious. He did not argue and he did not defend himself. He simply continued clearing the dishes, which only made me feel more victorious. Yet inside, there was a flicker of unease because his silence no longer felt like surrender, but like something heavier. The children started noticing changes too, because Sophie asked me once why Daddy looked sad at dinner, and I quickly told her he was just tired from work. Daniel began clinging to him more and more, and though I told myself it was just a phase, I knew deep down it was something different. Helen visited and told me plainly that I was humiliating her son, and I snapped at her saying she was interfering in matters that did not concern her. Edward told me to calm down and said Michael would forgive me like always, but his voice carried less strength than before. Clara kept cheering me on, but even she seemed nervous when she saw how cold Michael had become. One evening, I noticed him carrying a folder into his office and locking the drawer. And though I felt curious, I dismissed it, thinking he was burying himself in more work. I did not yet realize that folder was the collection of everything I had given him to use against me. The days after that family dinner began to blur together, and yet I can still remember the strange quietness that seemed to follow Michael everywhere. He came home from work at his usual time. He helped Daniel with his blocks on the living room floor, and he read Sophie her bedtime story as though nothing was different. But I noticed small details that made me uneasy. He no longer laughed politely at my jokes when I spoke too loudly in front of others. He no longer gave me those patient smiles when I teased him about working late. Instead, he moved through the house with the steady focus of someone following a plan I could not see. I told myself I was imagining things, but in my stomach I knew his silence had shifted into something more dangerous. At work, Julian grew bolder, and I let him. He leaned close during small conversations and complimented the way I dressed, and I accepted every word as if it was the attention I deserved. When he invited me for coffee, I agreed without hesitation, telling myself it was only a friendly chat. But as the days went on, I began seeing him more often outside the office, and I carried those moments home like secret prizes. I compared his attention to Michael's silence, and I told myself I was justified in taking what Michael refused to give. Clara encouraged me constantly. She told me Michael was dull and lucky to even have me, and she reminded me that women like us were meant for excitement, not quiet husbands. I believed her, and the belief made me reckless. One evening at a restaurant with friends, I decided to push Michael again. I bragged that Julian had been admiring me, and that even Michael's own boss treated me with more excitement. The table went quiet for a moment, and though Clara laughed loudly to cover the silence, I could feel the discomfort of everyone else. Michael sat still and pale, staring down at his drink, and I told the table that he was boring everyone by refusing to laugh. Later that night, I accused him of ruining the atmosphere with his seriousness, and I claimed that he enjoyed playing the victim. He said nothing, only stacked the dishes and washed them carefully, and the quiet sound of water and plates echoed through the kitchen like a warning I did not understand. The children noticed the difference too. Sophie asked me why Daddy no longer smiled at dinner, and I told her he was tired from work. Daniel began shadowing Michael everywhere, tugging at his sleeve whenever I entered the room, and I hated the way he clung to his father instead of me. Helen visited soon after and told me directly that I was destroying her son's dignity in front of the whole family. I lashed back and accused her of meddling, but she remained calm and simply told me she pitied me. Edward tried to soothe me by saying Michael would never act rashly, but I could hear the hesitation in his voice, and it frightened me more than I admitted. Clara kept telling me to stay strong and said men like Michael always broke down eventually when they realized their wives were too lively for them. She told me to keep embarrassing him until he admitted I was in charge. But even Clara seemed uncertain when she saw how little Michael reacted. She asked me once if I thought he might be planning something, and I laughed it off, but my chest tightened because I had thought the same thing. Then one evening, I walked past his office and noticed the locked drawer again. He slipped a folder inside and closed it with a deliberate movement that made my skin prickle. I told myself it was nothing but paperwork from his job, but deep down I knew it was something else. I remembered every time I had mocked him, every careless joke about Julian, every message I had left on my phone. I knew if he had been watching closely, there was more than enough to use against me. Still, I convinced myself that Michael was too quiet and too weak to take any real action. Julian continued sending me messages late at night, telling me I was exciting and fun, and I let those words cover the fear growing inside me. I told myself that Michael was too dull to compete, that silence meant surrender, and that I would always come out on top. I laughed at the thought that he might even try to challenge me, because what power did a man with no words really have? The answer came during a family gathering at Helen's home. Surrounded by relatives, I once again mocked Michael by laughing that even his own boss had made me feel more alive than he ever had. The room froze. Helen's lips pressed into a thin line. Edward sighed heavily, and Clara nudged me under the table as if even she knew I had gone too far. Michael stood without a sound and walked out of the room, leaving me behind with my forced laughter. I told everyone he was sulking, that he could not handle a strong woman, and I claimed he would return like always. But the look on Helen's face told me otherwise. The next morning, a courier arrived with an envelope addressed to me. My hands trembled before I even opened it, and inside were divorce papers. There were custody requests and financial protections laid out in clear language that left no space for misunderstanding. Michael had finally acted, not with shouting, not with pleading, but with the full weight of legal action. I called his phone immediately, demanding he explain himself, but it went straight to voicemail. I left long messages telling him he was overreacting, that he was breaking apart our family for nothing, but his silence answered me louder than words. When I showed the papers to Clara, she told me it was a bluff meant to scare me, but her voice was unsteady and her eyes betrayed her doubt. Later that evening, Helen called me herself and said Michael was serious, that he had already spoken with lawyers, and that evidence was ready to be presented. I snapped at her and accused her of poisoning him, but her calm tone told me she was speaking the truth. For the first time in years, I felt powerless, because I realized his silence had never been weakness at all. It had been preparation. Michael's silence after the papers arrived felt heavier than anything I had ever known, because he no longer seemed like the man I could dismiss as dull or weak. He moved around the house with calm efficiency, preparing Sophie's school bag, folding Daniel's clothes, and setting out his work folder, as though nothing unusual was happening. I tried to corner him in the kitchen and demanded that he explain himself, but he said nothing, only glanced toward the stack of documents I had already read. I told myself he was being cruel and heartless, tearing apart our family over a misunderstanding, but my words rang hollow even in my own ears. I insisted to Clara that Michael was only bluffing and that he would never follow through, but when I saw him leaving early in the morning, with that same locked folder under his arm, I felt the dread settle deeper. I began trying to control the story by telling neighbors and friends that Michael was obsessed with money and appearances, that he only cared about control, and that he had lost touch with love. Some gave polite nods, but I could tell they were unconvinced. Later I realized why, because Michael had already quietly shown them the texts between me and Julian, the receipts for our coffee meetings, and even the times I had come home late after being with him. I tried to accuse him of spying, but I knew I had been careless, leaving trails everywhere, and he had simply been patient enough to gather them. Sophie began asking to spend more time with her father, and Daniel barely looked at me when I tried to play with him. I told myself they were being manipulated, that Michael and Helen were turning them against me. But deep down, I knew they were only responding to what they had seen. They had watched me laugh at their father while he stayed silent, and children always notice more than we want them to. Helen came by one afternoon and told me to prepare myself because Michael was serious about custody. I shouted at her that she was interfering, but she only told me calmly that I had humiliated her son for too long. Edward still tried to defend me at first, saying Michael should not throw away a marriage over jokes, but his voice lacked strength. He admitted one evening that he could not ignore the evidence Michael had gathered. Even Clara, who had always cheered me on, looked pale when Michael presented the first stack of documents at another family gathering. He laid them on the table with quiet composure, showing messages and times that lined up perfectly. I tried to laugh it off and said he had twisted everything, but the silence of the room told me no one believed me. Julian, who had once filled my phone with compliments, now pulled away completely. He stopped responding to my messages, claiming he did not want to be dragged into drama. I hated him for abandoning me, but I hated myself more for realizing I had risked everything for a man who vanished at the first sign of consequence. Michael, on the other hand, grew steadier. He spoke little, but every move he made was deliberate, and every document he produced was undeniable. I told Clara I still had the upper hand because no court would take children from their mother. But even she avoided my eyes when she said she hoped I was right. At night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, remembering each time I had mocked Michael, each time I had thrown Julian's name into conversation for attention, each time I had chosen laughter over respect. I realized then that I had handed Michael every weapon he now used against me. The day his lawyer sent the official notice for our court date, I sat at the kitchen table holding the letter with shaking hands. The children played upstairs with Michael, their laughter echoing through the walls, and I felt like a guest in my own home. I tried one last time to tell myself silence meant weakness, but now I understood it had been strength all along, and it was already too late to undo it. The morning of the court hearing, I dressed carefully, choosing clothes that made me look polished and respectable, telling myself appearances would sway opinion. I rehearsed in my head how I would argue that I was a loving mother, that my so-called mistakes were nothing more than jokes and playful moments blown out of proportion. I told myself the judge would see Michael as stiff and joyless, while I would appear warm and misunderstood. But once I entered the courtroom and saw Michael seated calmly beside his lawyer, a thick folder neatly stacked in front of them, my confidence began to slip. He did not even look at me with anger. He simply waited with the patience of someone who already knew the outcome. When the proceedings began, his lawyer spoke in a calm and steady voice, laying out a timeline of my behavior with precision. The texts between me and Julian were read aloud, my words about how boring Michael was and how I deserved more excitement echoing through the silent room. I tried to interrupt and say those were only private ventings, nothing serious, but the judge reminded me to wait my turn. Then came the receipts from coffee shops, the timestamps of my late returns, the overlaps that matched perfectly with my phone records. I wanted to scream that it was coincidence, but everyone could see the pattern. My attempt to dismiss it as harmless friendship sounded thin against the clear order of evidence. Then they spoke about the children. They described how Sophie had asked her father why I laughed at him in front of others, and how Daniel clung to Michael when I entered the room. Each example cut deeper than the last, because I knew those moments had really happened, and I had brushed them off. I tried to defend myself by saying Michael had always been distant, more interested in work than family, but the judge looked unimpressed. The contrast was clear. His side presented quiet, documented proof, while mine offered excuses. When it was my turn, I insisted I had never meant to hurt Michael, that I was simply trying to lighten moods with jokes, but the silence in the courtroom told me no one believed. Michael finally spoke, not loudly, not angrily, just with the same calm strength he had carried for months. He explained how he had endured repeated humiliation, how he had chosen not to fight publicly for the sake of the children, and how he had decided finally to protect them through legal means. His voice never wavered, and the judge listened intently. I realized then that his silence had not been retreat. It had been building power. Clara sat behind me, her face pale and expressionless. She had always encouraged me, but even she could not deny what was laid out in front of everyone. My father Edward avoided my eyes, and I knew his loyalty had shifted. Helen sat behind Michael with a look of satisfaction, not gloating, just confirming that the truth had finally come to light. I had no one left to twist the story for me. The judge announced the decision clearly. Primary custody to Michael, visitation for me, the family home under his control, financial protections granted in his favor. My chest tightened as the words echoed, because it was everything I had laughed at, now written into law. Michael simply nodded, gathered his papers, and stood with a composure that made me feel smaller than ever. He did not look at me with triumph. He only looked forward, and I realized there was nothing left to argue. As we left the courthouse, people gave Michael respectful nods while avoiding my eyes. Clara walked beside me silently, unable to defend me anymore. Edward muttered that Michael had done what he needed to, and Helen embraced her son as though he had finally reclaimed what I had stolen from him. I followed behind, realizing the laughter I once used to control rooms had now destroyed me, and the silence I once despised had turned into the sharpest weapon my husband ever held. When we returned home after the ruling, The house looked exactly the same, yet felt completely different, because every wall and corner now belonged to Michael, not only in practice but by law. He walked in with Sophie holding one hand and Daniel clutching the other, moving with quiet certainty, as though the weight of the courtroom had never touched him. I followed behind, feeling like an intruder, my footsteps echoing in a place where I once believed I was in control. He set Sophie's books on the table, asked Daniel to put away his toys, and continued his routine as if nothing had changed, but the truth was everything had. I tried to speak, telling him we could still fix things, that the court ruling did not have to be the end, but he did not answer. He simply opened another envelope, placed it on the counter, and walked upstairs with the children. My hands shook as I tore it open, finding finalized updates on custody and financial terms. Every line reinforced what the judge had said, that Michael was now the stable parent, the one with the home, the one with the steady hand. My role had been reduced to scheduled visits and narrow responsibilities. I told myself this was cruel, that he was punishing me unfairly, but the truth was clear. He had not needed to punish me at all. I had done that myself. During my first visitation, Sophie asked gently if her father would come along, and I felt my heart sink when she said she felt safer when he was there. Daniel barely let go of Michael's sleeve, and though I tried to distract him with games, he only asked when it would be time to go back home. I wanted to tell them I was still their mother, and nothing could change that, but their eyes told me they already saw the change. They had chosen stability over noise, and Michael had given them that stability without ever raising his voice. Clara called that evening and tried to encourage me, saying I could appeal, but her voice no longer carried the same conviction. She admitted she had underestimated Michael, that his silence had been more powerful than we ever imagined. My father visited once and told me quietly that Michael had done what was right for the children, and that perhaps this would teach me the cost of careless words. Hearing that from him hurt more than anything, because he had always defended me before. Helen did not speak to me at all anymore, but I often saw her helping Michael in the yard, carrying groceries, or tucking Sophie's hair behind her ear, and her presence in what had once been my space was another reminder of my loss. Julian was gone entirely, leaving no trace except for the texts and receipts that had been read aloud in court. I scrolled through the old messages late at night, trying to remember why I had thought they were worth everything, but all I saw now was shallow flattery and empty words. I realized then that I had risked my family for attention that meant nothing, while Michael, the man I once mocked for being too quiet, had built his strength in silence. Every time I visited, I saw how the children leaned into him, how they laughed at his small jokes, how they trusted him completely. I tried to insert myself into those moments, but it only highlighted how far I had fallen from their trust. The woman who once thought she was the center of the family was now standing on the outside looking in. The night it became final, Michael walked past me in the hallway, holding the finalized papers in one hand and Daniel's small hand in the other. He did not speak. He did not look at me with anger. He simply moved forward with a calm dignity that crushed me more than shouting ever could. I stood there frozen with nothing left to say, finally understanding that the silence I had ridiculed for years had been his answer all along, and it had ended everything. That night, after Michael walked past me with the papers in hand, I stood in the hallway for what felt like hours, listening to the sounds of him tucking the children into bed. Their laughter carried down the stairs, light and unbroken, and I realized they were already adjusting to a life where I was little more than a visitor. I wanted to march upstairs and remind them I was still their mother, but something in me froze because I knew they would only turn toward him. That knowledge hurt worse than the court ruling because it showed me where their hearts truly rested. When I finally entered the kitchen again, the counter was bare, except for the empty envelope Michael had left behind. I touched it with trembling fingers, as if some warmth still remained from his hand, and I felt a bitter twist inside me. I had spent so long mocking his silence, calling it weakness, and now I understood it had been the very thing that gave him power. My jokes, my careless laughter, my smug confidence had all become the evidence that pushed me out of my own home. I had spoken myself into ruin, and he had needed to say almost nothing. In the days that followed, the pattern became clear. Michael carried on with his routines, steady as ever, while I hovered on the edges of the life I once thought belonged to me. He woke Sophie on time for school, packed her bag, reminded Daniel to brush his teeth, and left for work with a quiet nod. I remained behind with my thoughts and my shame, trying to convince myself that somehow I could still change things. I told myself he would soften once the anger faded, but the truth was that there had never been anger, only determination. His silence had already closed every door. During my visitation hours, I tried to be lively, telling the children about games we could play and places we could go, but their excitement dimmed when they realized their father would not be joining us. Sophie asked again if he could come along, and Daniel only wanted to return to the house before the time was over. I smiled through the pain, pretending everything was fine, but inside I felt like I was fading from their world. Each laugh they shared with Michael, each moment they leaned into him, became another reminder that I had traded their trust for empty attention. Clara stopped calling as often, and when she did, her tone was softer, almost apologetic. She admitted she had pushed me to keep humiliating Michael because she thought he would never stand up for himself. She said she never imagined he would gather evidence so quietly and strike so effectively. Her words did not comfort me. They only deepened the hollow inside my chest. My father, too, spoke less to me. When he did, he told me directly that I needed to accept responsibility, that Michael had acted not out of cruelty, but out of protection for the children. I hated hearing it, but I knew he was right. Helen never said a word to me again, but I often caught sight of her in the yard, carrying groceries into the kitchen or sitting with Sophie and Daniel on the porch. The sight of her in what had been my space burned like salt on a wound, because it showed that the family had already chosen their side, and it was not mine. Late at night, when I was alone, I opened my phone and scrolled through the messages from Julian. They were once thrilling, little sparks of validation that made me feel alive, but now they looked hollow and pathetic. He had vanished completely the moment trouble began, leaving me to face the ruin alone. I wanted to scream at him for disappearing, but the truth was that he had never been the problem. The problem had been me, laughing too loudly at the man who loved me, thinking I was untouchable. And so the house grew quieter each day, filled with Michael's steady presence and the children's easy laughter, while my voice no longer belonged. I realized then that the silence I once feared had swallowed me whole, leaving nothing but the memory of my careless jokes and the echo of what they had cost me. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city are you watching.